Welcome to the second video in the series on how newsrooms can better safeguard their journalists from online abuse and harassment. In the first session, you were asked to survey your journalists to get a deeper understanding of the problem of online harassment and abuse as it manifests in your workplace. You were also asked to review the processes and support you already have in place in order to identify the strengths and weaknesses of the steps your organisation has taken so far. In this session, we're going to build on this by exploring what good practice looks like with regard to preventing attacks, in order to think about what could be done to improve your own current practices. The most important part of any protocol is prevention. That is, measures that are taken to minimise the risk of attack and to minimise the harm that an attack can potentially cause to the person who's targeted. In the last video, we saw that IPI have come up with some suggestions of what structures and support mechanisms newsrooms need to put in place, and they've drawn up a 4-step protocol to support targeted journalists, which draws on those structures and support mechanisms. To refresh your memory, the 4 steps are: Step 1, reporting. This is about establishing clear reporting lines and a culture in the newsroom that encourages journalists to report. Step 2 is risk assessment. People need to be trained to assess the risk and to recognise harms and to act proportionately. Step 3 is about implementing support mechanisms. You need to have informal and formal mechanisms already in place to support journalists, whatever the level of risk. And finally, step 4 is tracking and reassessment. This is about record keeping, so that you keep an eye on what abuse and harassment is happening, what you did about it, what worked, what didn't, and so on. However, in practice, this is not a linear process which starts at step 1, reporting, and ends with step 4, tracking. Rather, these 4 steps are better understood as a circular process. This is because alongside these 4 steps, we also need to think in terms of prevention and recovery. Reporting, risk assessment, support and tracking do not begin once an attack has happened and end once it has been dealt with. These steps are ongoing and to be effective, they all need to be in place before any attack has occurred. A newsroom that takes the safety of its staff seriously will do everything it can to prevent online attacks and minimise the harm they cause. You certainly need to have both reporting and support mechanisms in place before you need them, and there needs to be a pre-existing culture in place that encourages journalists to share their experiences. You might also do a risk assessment before any piece of journalism has been published or broadcast. You might assess the likelihood of a particular story leading to the abuse or harassment of the reporter, for example, and you might assess the risk factors experienced by a particular journalist. And tracking cases of abuse will also help you to both understand the risks and prevent further attacks. So, what does good preventative practice look like? Awareness raising and regular communication will help to create a culture of safety in the newsroom around online harassment. There is a lot of evidence to suggest that many journalists, perhaps most, don't feel that they can report online attacks to their managers. They think they won't be taken seriously, or worse, will be thought oversensitive and not tough enough for the job. Women in particular often worry about this. There are still many journalists and media managers who do not understand the harm that online attacks can cause and who therefore don't take it seriously. In order to create a culture where the abuse and harassment of journalists is not tolerated, employees must feel supported enough to report their experience, knowing that they'll be understood and that appropriate action will be taken. Acknowledging the existence of digital violence in the workplace and the harm it can cause is crucial. So too is acknowledging the gendered and racialised nature of much digital abuse and harassment, because the journalists who are most likely to be targeted are often already marginalised and so may have legitimate concerns about reporting. By surveying your staff, or if yours is a small newsroom, simply by talking to them, you have already taken the first step in creating a culture of safety in your newsroom, because you have let your journalists know that you want to hear from them. It's good practice to repeat this process regularly, an annual survey for example, or by making space for discussion of online attacks in your regular editorial meetings. Training is also essential. All your journalists, staff and freelance, should know that online harassment against journalists is an attack on the entire organisation. They should know that management stands behind its journalists. They should know what your safety protocol is, both offline and online. And they should understand what best practice for using social media is. In addition, as many people as possible in your organisation need to understand the mechanics of how attacks on social media take place and the form these attacks commonly take. They need to understand the current hot topics in your local environment that provoke attacks. They need to be aware of the individuals, groups or political parties that are known to behave aggressively towards the content you publish. And they need to understand when legal action might be both possible and appropriate. This training might be led by a digital safety officer, and it should be regularly updated. It should also be part of the induction process for new staff. So you need to think about who does what in your organisation. Do you have a digital safety officer? If not, you need one. That person needs to have the necessary expertise. They need to lead the training of the rest of the staff. They need to keep abreast of developments in this area, and they need to be involved in induction of new staff members. An effective protocol will establish clear reporting lines. It's not enough to encourage journalists to report digital harassment. Targeted journalists need to know who to tell, how to tell, and they need to feel confident that they will not be penalised if they do tell. It is helpful if there is a single point of contact. The person within the organisation who they report to needs to have the necessary training to respond effectively. They need to respond quickly, and they need to give a human response. They need to let the journalist know that they've been heard and that the matter is in hand. And they need to know when to refer the case to a response team, i.e. a group of people with the relevant knowledge and expertise to respond effectively to even the most serious cases of abuse and harassment. Underreporting will occur if any of these needs are not met. So who does what here? You need to have a response team. This should include a senior member of the editorial staff to give editorial expertise, someone who has legal expertise, someone with digital expertise, and someone who has employment responsibilities or responsibilities for staff welfare, usually a human resources department, for example. It's important to have your response team in place before online attacks occur. You need to identify the people who have the authority and the expertise to deal with attacks when they take place. To help with this, you can refer back to the worksheet from the first section on people and roles. But as a minimum, you need a senior member of the editorial team, someone with legal expertise, someone with digital expertise, and someone who manages social media. You also need someone with HR responsibilities. In small organisations, one person might carry out more than one of these functions, but all of these fields of expertise need to be in the response team. We will talk more about reporting lines and response teams when we look at recovery from online abuse and harassment. But in terms of prevention, reporting is crucial because you need to understand the nature of abuse in your newsroom in order to be able to take steps to prevent attacks and to minimise the harm caused by attacks that do occur. So far, we've looked at how you can create a culture of safety in the newsroom and how you can encourage reporting not only by making sure that online attacks are understood, but by establishing clear reporting lines. But understanding the nature of online abuse in your particular environment will also help you devise preventative risk assessments. An effective prevention protocol will include a gender and race-sensitive assessment of the risk of exposure to online harassment and abuse before a journalist is assigned to a story and before that story is published or broadcast. This should be built into every stage of the editorial process, from assigning a story to choosing editorial choices such as headlines and so on. For example, if you know a story is on a topic that often provokes a racist response, you might decide to only publish at a time when you have the capacity to moderate the comments and monitor social media effectively. Or if a journalist is covering a story that is likely to expose them to sexist abuse or rape threats, you might have another member of staff monitor their social media accounts to minimise their exposure. So who does what here when it comes to pre-publication risk assessment? Everyone who is involved in commissioning stories, assigning them and publishing them needs to think about whether the journalist is likely to experience abuse or harassment online as a result, and to think about how to minimise that risk. Support mechanisms are a crucial part of any preventative strategy, and they need to be in place before attacks happen. Digital security training is crucial. As a minimum, all journalists should be offered digital security training aimed at protecting their devices, communications and personal data, all of which could potentially be compromised as part of an online attack. Digital security experts agree that this training should include the proper use of passwords, two-step authentication, data encryption, general protection of personal data, protection from malware, and the use of secure email. Digital security needs to be led at the organisational level. It is difficult for individual journalists to make the behavioural and technological changes without institutional support. A protocol that puts the responsibility of digital security onto the individual may unintentionally shift the responsibility onto those most likely to be targeted, and this can normalise gendered and racialised online abuse. Organisational support might include setting time aside for a formal training programme for staff and regular freelancers. It might include keeping encryption software up to date and ensuring that journalists do not have to use their personal phones and laptops for work. Digital security training should be offered to everybody, but it should be gender and race aware. Additional sessions might target high-risk groups, including women and people of colour. All journalists should be encouraged to discover for themselves how much of their personal information is available online and should be shown how to clean up their digital footprint. And for particularly high-risk individuals, you might arrange personalised digital security risk assessments in which someone with advanced digital skills checks and cleans their digital footprint. You can also build other support mechanisms before any attack has taken place. These may be informal, such as a chat group for female journalists in and outside your organisation who can share experiences and be ready to engage in preemptive counter-speech, for example. Or they can be formal, such as a peer support network. In IPI's protocol for newsrooms, you will find lots of examples of both informal and formal mechanisms. So who does what when it comes to support mechanisms? The digital safety officer should take care of digital safety. All of the journalists should think about informal mechanisms of support that they can help establish and be part of, and managing editors might look into the costs of formal mechanisms such as peer support. As part of your preventative strategy, you should also think about how to foster a community online. Your audience can be your greatest support, but a poorly managed community can be a source of online harassment and abuse. If you spend time and resources on fostering a constructive community online, your audience can become an important line of defence against attacks. And for this reason, a newsroom that chooses to encourage audience engagement must think holistically about the kind of community they want to build and the kind of engagement they want to foster. You will certainly need clear and robust community standards, and these need to be readily available to your audience. Effective moderation is key. You need to have enough trained moderators to properly manage the conversations you host online, and they need to have the digital tools they need to do a good job. Some newsrooms take active steps to engage with the comments in order to keep the conversation constructive. This can be very effective. But in larger organisations, a very high volume of comments makes such engagement impossible, in which case limiting the number of articles that are open to comments is important to ensure adequate moderation. You might decide that all comments, or just those below sensitive articles, are either disabled or are pre-moderated. We'll talk more about moderation when we look at recovery, but for now I just want to make the point that fostering a community is also an important part of any preventative protocol. If you foster a good community online, your audience can alert you to abuse and harassment and will spontaneously engage in counter-speech. So, to summarise, IPI's 4-step protocol to support targeted journalists operates at the level of both prevention and recovery. To prevent attacks, organisations need to create a culture of safety in the newsroom around online harassment. They need to establish clear reporting lines and actively encourage journalists to report abuse and harassment. They need to document instances of abuse and harassment. They need to put together a team with the expertise needed to respond effectively. They need to consider the likelihood of online attacks as part of a risk assessment process. They need to offer digital security training and foster a supportive community online through editorial approaches such as moderation and social media management. I'd now like to suggest that you do 2 things. Your first task today is to think about who does what in your organisation. Last time you used the worksheet provided to consider who in your organisation currently does what. Thinking about prevention, are there any important roles that are not being carried out by any member of staff at the moment? Are there any bottlenecks, i.e. individuals who are responsible for too much? And how can you fill those gaps and ease those bottlenecks? Whereas before you were thinking about how things were right now, this time I want you to think about how things would ideally be. If money were no object, what would you put in place? Who would do what? Your second task is to begin to map a prevention protocol for your organisation. You've already mapped what your organisation is doing at the moment to counter online abuse and harassment. Now it's time to start thinking about how you can build on this to create a fully functioning protocol, starting with a blueprint for the preventative measures you'd like to put in place. So thinking about the various ways in which organisations can prevent online abuse and harassment, you need to think about what might be both possible and useful in the context of your own newsroom, and what concrete steps you might take in the future to create a safer workplace for your journalists. Use the worksheet provided to make a note of the systems and structures you need. You should also include any measures that you're already taking, but whereas last time you were mapping the way things are now, this time you're thinking about how you would ideally want them to be. And in the final column, make a note of any obstacles to putting those things in place, including financial implications and training needs. You can use the template provided to help you with this.